Everyone, this is working on step 2 of the intermediate class master copy project, where you are supposed to choose a photo of a painting by either Monet or Van Gogh out of the folder of images that I've uploaded online, and that link should be in your module. Please make sure that you pick an image out of the folder and don't decide on your own unless you get approval from me. There are other ones that I would approve. I don't think I've gotten every single Van Gogh or Monet in there, but some of their paintings I wouldn't approve just because they're too realistically based in color or whatever. So one of the things that we're working on is how to interpret this idea of light as paint. And that's a very different precept from what we were talking about in the first semester of beginning painting, where we're worrying much more about how we interpret objects and how we show objects three-dimensional qualities and form. That was not Monet's primary concern. He was more just really interested in the way light shifted and changed, how color showed those light shifts. And so he had a number of series that he did. A couple off the top of my head are the Cathedral series, which this is one of them. This is a morning one. And I don't know how many he did. And another series that he did was the Haystacks. And I don't know how many of like the cathedral paintings he did, but there's at least 20 or so, I'm guessing. Different times of the day, different seasons of the year. And so this is one of the ones that was from morning that I started interpreting. And going through here, as I do my first pass on this and try and get my bottom layer, what I'm always remembering and keeping in mind is that what I see, the final image here, is not necessarily what goes down here. And by that I mean that there might be areas that maybe I have a stronger pink that I might put in an area, or a lot more of the reddish brownish tone here. But then later on, I'm going to come back in with more blue and start covering it up a little bit at a time and trying to get that effect to knock back. Or I might be lowering the value on this area here. Maybe I put it in a little bit too dark to start with. It is a little bit on the darker side when I block it in. So what I have blocked in right now was shown in the first step video, and that's just some of these larger shadow areas as well as the sky. And then I put an undertone on here so that I would always feel like I was interacting with a color that made sense with how my painting was supposed to end up. So I started off with mixing a pink, and I realized as I got further into this painting that essentially this whole painting is basically done in a mixture of using basically the cadmium red, the cobalt violet, and some white, and I used just a tiny bit of Indian red to make this a little bit more on the red scale instead of the blue scale when I mix the blue into it. So those were my colors and some white, and I have a feeling, and I've got some warm white in here as well, although that's more just because I wanted that warm tone. But I have a feeling that predominantly this painting is going to be done in that very limited palette. So it's much more about the interaction of those colors and what values you're putting down. You can notice here that I've got a little bit more of a lavender tone going in because I mixed a little bit of my cadmium red and cobalt and then lightened it up a lot so that I could get something closer to a lavender in here. I don't know as I build up in the next steps if I might introduce maybe one more color for a little bit more richness. But at this point, and especially by the time I got done blocking all this in, it was actually feeling pretty good to me as far as like the understanding of the value and color. So keep that in mind. Depending on what you pick, it might only be a few colors. Don't feel like you've got to lay everything out. I came back through and was trying to establish areas of drawing as I was doing this. A lot of the paintings that we look at from these time periods, at least the ones in the folder, tend to have not like a lot of drawing going into them. And so they're predominantly more about the light and shade in this case. And so what I find is that it's actually a lot easier, rather than drawing in all these details, to get the overall structure, in this case of the building, correct, and then to come back and indicate the details just by painting them in as I go. So here it just shows continuing to go through that and block in the different colors. I want you guys to sit through 40 minutes of me doing this. And you can kind of see how the painting just slowly builds. And one thing that I really try to do is I try to kind of not focus on the details so much, but focus on kind of my overall impressions of how the light and shadow and the color are reading, and then use an overall impression of how the light and the shadow and the color are reading here. So this was me starting to block in some of this warm tone, warm kind of violety brown tone that goes in. Then I knocked it back in, added a bunch of paint. And one thing that I think you'll discover, it's something that I feel happens for sure, is that if you use one of our nice big heavy good quality brushes, it's going to build up so much paint and it's all going to be in that brush, and it's going to be really hard to get it down without moving more paint. Okay, so on this one, you could use some cheap brushes or sticking with smaller. If you kind of notice when I come up, even though I'm painting big areas, I'm using a pretty small brush tip because it's easier for me to pick up and place the paint with that. The other thing that a lot of people do is they use palette knives for placing the paint, and that's certainly completely acceptable. In fact, some of the paintings almost, especially some of the Van Goghs, almost look like they were painted with a palette knife. So please feel free to do that, or if you're somebody that spends a little too much time blending and you just can't seem to stop yourself, switch to the palette knife and try palette knife tips for placing the paint and getting the main painting done. So here you can just kind of see the painting is mostly blocked in at this point. I didn't get the last like 10 or 15 minutes on video, but this is a majority of that first step. And that's basically where I would end. I'll probably do a little bit more work tonight and try and clean up some of like this drawing stuff here that I want to clean up, and maybe a few things like getting in some of the windows and some of the smaller forms in some areas. But other than that, this is basically done until it dries out. The other thing I want to mention is that I did mix wax medium into my paint the entire time I was working. I would mix a pile of paint, get the color I want, and then mix about the same amount of wax into that pile of paint. So I basically had a pile that was half paint and half wax. And if you're using something such as the wax medium or another impasto medium, which hopefully you are, because they help you save a lot on paint, you'll use way more paint than you should be if you don't add that stuff in. But the other thing too is the straight paint takes forever to dry on some of the colors. Some of the colors, you put them down and 2 or 3 weeks from now, they'll still be wet and moving around. So using the wax or impasto medium of some sort will help your painting dry out. And this is something that I expect I could go back in, like when I was reworking some of these sky areas right after this, I realized that they were already setting up and drying to the touch where I had to kind of push back into the paint to make it move. So I think in a day or two, this will actually be fairly dry and I can start placing another layer on it. Thank you.